He was born into a world of gold, yet he died in the haze of wine. Archduke Ferdinand Charles of Austria, heir to the wealthy lands of Tyrol, left this world at just 34. Not by sword, not by poison, not by conspiracy, but by the indulgence of his own hand. His was a life that burned bright but brief, a dynasty cut off in laughter and intoxication, where every toast carried him closer to silence. In the spring air of 1628, Innsbruck stirred with the birth of a child whose cradle was wrapped not in plain cloth, but in brocade heavy with gold. Ferdinand Charles of Austria entered the world as the son of Leopold V, the Archduke of Tyrol, and Claudia de' Medici, a woman whose blood carried the cunning and artistry of Florence. But fortune has a way of bending its gifts. At the tender age of 4, the boy stood at his father's funeral, too young to understand the tolling bells that echoed through the mountains, too small to grasp that his father's death meant he had already inherited a throne. It was Claudia who stepped forward, not only his mother, but as regent, her hand steadying both her child and the fragile principality. She was a Medici, steeped in politics, patient in calculation, sharp as glass beneath velvet gloves. Under her rule, Tyrol prospered. Markets bustled, coin flowed, alliances were secured, and the people whispered that though their ruler was a child, their land was guided by a queen in all but name. Yet for Ferdinand Charles, growing up beneath such shadow meant he knew power not as discipline, but as spectacle. The halls of Innsbruck were not like the cold gray keeps of the north. They bloomed with Italian tapestries, marble statues, and music that poured from every chamber like honey. Artists and scholars dined beside bishops and soldiers, each leaving behind fragments of brilliance that dazzled the young duke. He learned to admire beauty, to crave the richness of life's flavors, but not to shoulder the burden of restraint. His tutors wrote in their diaries of a boy quick to laugh, quick to tire of study, quick to reach for diversion rather than duty. While other princes were drilled in the art of command, Ferdinand Charles wandered through gardens of carved fountains, chasing falcons and dogs, his heart swelling not at the thought of battle, but at the gleam of a polished goblet. He was like a grapevine nourished in fertile soil, left to grow wild without the cut of the pruning knife. Lush, green, promising fruit, but fruit that might rot before ripening. And yet, no one could say he was unloved. Innsbruck adored its child duke. Pageants were held in his honor, the people waving banners as he smiled from a carriage drawn through the cobbled streets. His mother, wise enough to cloak weakness in ceremony, made sure every appearance glimmered with authority. To the outside world, he was the perfect heir. Young, bright-eyed, draped in velvet, the future of Tyrol. But behind those smiling portraits hung in gilded frames, the truth was quieter. A boy raised in admiration, but untouched by hardship. A prince who would inherit not the discipline of his forefathers, but the appetite of his court. The bells that had tolled for his father now chimed for feast days, and the boy grew accustomed to music not as mourning, but as celebration. He was never denied. Sweet wines, rich meats, long hunts in the mountains, everything his heart desired was placed in his path. The people called him blessed. His courtiers called him charming. Yet beneath the blessings, beneath the charm, something essential was missing. The gravity of responsibility, the iron weight of consequence. In the quiet corners of the palace, some whispered that Claudia's careful governance gave him too much freedom, that in protecting her son from the harshness of rule, she had created a man who would never truly learn to govern. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps it was then, in those soft golden years of childhood, that his fate was already being written. Not by the enemies he would one day face, but by the pleasures that surrounded him like a velvet shroud. Like a candle lit too brightly in its first hours, Ferdinand Charles was burning faster than anyone could see. The year was 1646, and Innsbruck shimmered with anticipation. Banners hung from every window, bells rang across the valley, and courtiers rushed through gilded halls preparing for a wedding that was not born of love, but of necessity. Ferdinand Charles of Austria, the young Archduke with Tyrol's wealth at his fingertips, was to marry Anna de' Medici. De' Medici, Bilcartamois. His cousin, his equal in bloodline, yet not in affection. The union was carefully arranged, the product of negotiations that wound their way through both Vienna and Florence, through Habsburg pride and Medici ambition. To the common people, it was a spectacle. Two dynasties intertwined in the splendor of holy matrimony. To diplomats, it was a strategic knot meant to hold fragile alliances together. But for the groom and bride themselves, it was a gilded cage closed with the clang of solemn vows. On that wedding day, the cathedral glowed with candlelight, its walls echoing with sacred chants. Anna walked the aisle with regal poise, her gown trailing like a river of silver. Ferdinand Charles stood at the altar, handsome and richly dressed, yet his eyes betrayed no tenderness, only the polished expression of duty. The priest's voice rose, the rings were exchanged, and the crowd cheered. But beneath the golden arches of the church, the silence between bride and groom was heavier than the organ's thunder. They returned to Innsbruck as husband and wife, riding through streets lined with jubilant citizens. Wine flowed, feasts sprawled for days, minstrels sang of prosperity and union. But within the palace walls, the reality began to take shape. Their chambers, though adjacent, became islands. They dined together in public, but in private, their words were brief, their glances distant. Anna, disciplined and pious, carried the sharp wit of her Medici ancestors. She valued order, propriety, and devotion. Ferdinand Charles, however, leaned toward extravagance, preferring the thrill of the hunt, the echo of laughter in banquet halls, the sweet sting of wine at his lips. Where Anna sought stability, Ferdinand sought distraction. Their marriage was less the fusion of hearts and more the clinking of two goblets set beside each other. Fragile, crystalline, never truly touching. The courtiers noticed. They whispered that the Archduke grew restless, often slipping away from Anna's company to indulge in pursuits more to his taste. Some nights, music echoed from his private chambers long after midnight. Violins, lutes, bursts of drunken laughter. While Anna sat alone by candlelight, penning letters to relatives in Florence, her ink blotting the page like unspoken sorrow. As years passed, the absence of an heir cast a deepening shadow over their union. Tyrol, though rich, was politically fragile, and the Habsburg family looked anxiously at Innsbruck, waiting for news of a son who would secure the future. But no son came. Anna bore no child, and whispers turned into doubts, doubts into rumors. Was it her fault? Was it his? Or was it fate itself mocking the grandeur of dynastic marriage by denying its most essential fruit? In the cold corridors of Hofburg Palace, those questions clung like mist. Courtiers avoided speaking them aloud in the presence of their rulers. Yet gossip traveled quickly. Perhaps the Archduke found no joy in his wife's bed. Perhaps his nights were spent elsewhere, in the company of courtesans or companions who shared his love for wine and merriment. Anna, though humiliated, endured with quiet dignity. She carried herself as though nothing were amiss, her posture straight, her voice calm. But the distance between them widened, like a crack in marble spreading silently until the whole structure threatened collapse. For Ferdinand Charles, the absence of love at home only sharpened his hunger for pleasure beyond it. He filled his days with hunts in the Tyrolean forests, grand hunts that stretched for miles, with falcons wheeling in the sky and the echoes of hounds rolling like thunder. He filled his nights with lavish entertainments, with tables groaning under silver platters, with jugglers and musicians brought from Italy to keep boredom at bay. To him, life became a stage, and every evening demanded its performance. And yet, behind the velvet curtains and jeweled goblets, a quiet truth lingered. The prince was lonely. Surrounded by sycophants, adored by flatterers, he lacked the anchor of a true companion. Anna could not be that anchor, nor perhaps did he allow her the chance. In his restlessness, he mistook excess for fulfillment and indulgence for intimacy. One chronicler of the time described the couple as two stars distant in the heavens, bound by the same orbit, yet never colliding. Their palace mirrored that description. Corridors alive with color, music, and movement, yet at its heart, an emptiness no feast could fill. And so the tragedy deepened, not with a sudden blow of fate, but with the slow erosion of meaning. Their marriage, conceived to strengthen dynasties, had instead sown fragility. Without heirs, the line in Tyrol trembled. Without affection, the Archduke drifted further into excess. The halls that had once rung with promise now carried the echo of unfulfilled vows. It was here, in this sterile union, that the seed of Ferdinand Charles's downfall was planted. For a man denied true companionship often seeks solace in illusions, and his illusions came in bottles of wine, in laughter too loud to be genuine, in nights that blurred into mornings without memory. Two crystal goblets stood side by side on the banquet table, gleaming under candlelight. They never touched. They never sang together. And just as their marriage remained hollow, so too would their legacy echo with absence. A future unclaimed, a dynasty left childless. The people of Tyrol celebrated their rulers' anniversaries with parades and processions. But beneath the cheering, unease spread. What was a ruler worth if he left no heir? What was a marriage worth if it birthed no love? The questions lingered, unanswered, heavy as smoke in the rafters of Innsbruck's grand cathedral. And Ferdinand Charles, surrounded by luxury yet starved of connection, stepped deeper into the shadow of his own undoing. The court of Innsbruck became a theater of extravagance, and Ferdinand Charles its restless actor. While some princes carried swords and others balanced ledgers, he carried only a goblet, raising it high as though each toast could drown the quiet discontent in his chest. The halls of the Hofburg Palace grew accustomed to endless feasts, their ceilings echoing with laughter, music, and the sharp ring of silver against crystal. But beneath the brilliance of chandeliers and the perfume of roses, something darker lingered, the slow erosion of a realm starved of discipline. The feasts began innocently, a night of celebration after a hunt, a gathering to mark a feast day, a banquet for foreign envoys. But soon, they became a rhythm, as constant as the beating of his own heart. Each evening the tables groaned under weighty platters. Roasted boar glistening with fat, mountains of sugared almonds imported from Venice, rivers of red wine poured from barrels hauled over the Brenner Pass. Musicians sat in corners plucking their lutes, their melodies weaving through smoke and laughter. Courtiers laughed too loudly, eyes darting toward the Archduke to ensure their amusement pleased him. As the night stretched into dawn, servants slipped silently through the corridors, sweeping away broken glass, spilt wine, and candle wax hardened like melted gold across the marble floors. By morning, The palace smelled not of incense or prayer, but of stale drink and smoke. And still the revels did not stop. The people of Tyrol began to murmur. They had once admired their young duke, waving flags as he rode through the city. But now they whispered another name for him, the Prince of Excess. For every barrel of wine tapped in the palace, another family in the valleys felt the pinch of higher taxes. For every imported delicacy piled upon Ferdinand Charles's table, the granaries of his subjects seemed emptier. His court, once praised for its elegance, became infamous for its waste. Reports filtered back to Vienna. Innsbruck's treasury ran thin, coins flowing not to fortifications or alliances, but to jewelers, vintners, and entertainers. The Habsburg cousins shook their heads. Some ruled by sword, some by decree. Yet Ferdinand Charles ruled by indulgence. His reputation spread across Europe not as a warrior or statesman, but as a young man lost in pleasure, a sovereign drowning in goblets. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when he seemed to recognize the peril. Advisors approached him in whispers, warning that the coffers ran dry, that the people grumbled, that Tyrol could not sustain such endless consumption. He listened, nodded, and for a time even feigned restraint. But restraint never held him long. Like a man caught in the pull of a current, he drifted back toward the familiar comfort of wine, laughter, and spectacle. One chronicler painted the image of such a night. Ferdinand Charles, at the head of a table stretching the length of a hall, his face flushed, his hands restless, his laughter rolling like thunder across the chamber. He raised a goblet filled to the brim, red wine spilling over and staining the white tablecloth like blood. Around him, courtiers clapped and shouted, their eyes shining with the desperation of men who knew their fortunes rose and fell with his favor. Outside the palace walls, snow fell on the cobbled streets, quiet and cold, muffling the footsteps of beggars who shivered in the dark. The contrast was brutal. Inside, the candles roared like fire. Outside, the poor huddled in silence. The palace walls themselves seemed to tremble beneath the weight of contradiction. The brilliance of excess pressed against the suffering of the many. Yet Ferdinand Charles pressed on, each night heavier than the last. He ordered new wings built onto the palace to house his entertainments, invited performers from Italy whose spectacles dazzled the court, paid gold to alchemists, promising elixirs to prolong vigor and delight. He was no longer a ruler of Tyrol. He was its most demanding guest, draining the realm as though it were another goblet of wine. The symbolism of it all was impossible to ignore. Wine, once a sacrament, a symbol of blood and covenant, became in his hands a poison disguised as pleasure. Each drop he drank was a step further from duty. Each spill on the linen, another stain on his reign. And though his body still stood tall, the first cracks in his soul had begun to appear. At the edges of his court, a bitterness grew. Soldiers, unpaid, spoke of his weakness. Merchants complained of delayed debts. Farmers cursed as taxes rose to pay for feasts they would never see. But Ferdinand Charles shielded himself with music, with the perfume of women at his banquets, with the clinking of jewels sewn into his velvet sleeves. He believed, or pretended to believe, that as long as the candles burned bright, the shadows could not enter. But shadows do not wait. They stretch, they lengthen, they seep. And so the image of his reign hardened. While his ancestors left portraits of themselves with swords and crowns, Ferdinand Charles left an image of a man clutching a goblet, his smile too wide, his eyes too distant. He was no commander, no builder, no legislator. He was the Prince of Excess, the boy who grew up amid velvet and marble, who mistook pleasure for power and indulgence for love. One might say the palace itself tried to speak. Its walls, stained with smoke and wine, its foundations strained by the weight of debt, seemed to sigh each morning when the music finally died, as if stone itself mourned what flesh could not see. In Innsbruck, the people told a bitter joke, that their ruler was not the master of Tyrol, but its most expensive guest. And though their laughter was quiet, it carried further than they realized, echoing across valleys, across courts, across the empire. In those years, Ferdinand Charles still lived, still laughed, still drank. But his legacy had already begun to rot, like a grape left too long on the vine, swelling with sweetness until it split and soured. The Prince of Excess had arrived at his first climax, and the descent was only just beginning. The body, no matter how royal, no matter how young, cannot endure forever the slow poison of excess. For Ferdinand Charles, the first symptoms appeared as whispers, barely noticeable, then grew into screams that neither music nor wine could drown. At first it was fatigue that clung to him after a night's revel. His steps slower, his breath heavier. Courtiers excused it as the natural result of too much laughter, too much wine, too much merriment. But as the weeks turned into months, the fatigue no longer faded with the rising sun. It lingered, wrapping itself around his chest, tightening, gnawing. The Archduke's physicians began to notice. They kept journals describing the subtle transformation of a prince into a patient. His eyes, once bright, grew dim with a yellowish tinge. His hands trembled when he lifted his goblet. His skin, pale beneath the glow of candles, took on a gray hue. Still, Ferdinand Charles laughed it away. "Too much venison, too many hunts," he would say, waving aside their concern with a smile that grew tighter each day. But his laughter could not mask the truth. His stomach burned after every feast. His heart pounded erratically, his breath caught in his throat like a man drowning on dry land. When he climbed the marble stairs of Innsbruck's palace, he sometimes paused halfway, leaning on the banister, his chest heaving. The courtiers learned to look away, pretending not to notice the sheen of sweat on his brow. In public, he remained the prince of feasts. In private, he was a man betrayed by the very vessel that carried him. The physicians were summoned more often. They spoke to him of moderation, of temperance, of the dangers of wine that had soaked into his blood and organs. They warned that his liver, though they did not yet have the science to name it so, was swollen, failing. His heart, too, strained against the flood of toxins. Their words, written in neat Latin, carried the weight of prophecy. If he continues, his body will not endure. But prophecy requires belief. Ferdinand Charles did not believe. Or perhaps he did, but lacked the strength to act. To deny him wine was to deny him life itself, for he had built his identity not as a ruler, not as a husband, but as the center of endless feasts. To step away from the goblet was to admit emptiness, to face the silence that awaited him in Anna's cold chambers, in the echoing halls of duty he had long neglected. And so he chose the goblet. Night after night, though his hands shook, though his chest ached, though his stomach rebelled, he drank. Each sip was no longer pleasure but punishment, each swallow a knife turned inward. The wine that once symbolized vitality now became his executioner. Those who saw him in these years left chilling descriptions. One courtier wrote of a banquet in Kaltern where the Archduke sat at the head of the table, his face pale and glistening with sweat. The music played, the dancers spun, the laughter rang. But Ferdinand Charles seemed detached, his eyes hollow, his smile forced. When he raised his goblet, his hand shook so badly that the wine spilled across the linen, blooming red like a wound. Still, he drank. Still he laughed, though the sound rang brittle as broken glass. His body became a battlefield. His stomach twisted with pain, his breath grew short, his limbs heavy. At times he retched violently, collapsing into his chambers while servants fanned him and wiped his brow. The physicians prescribed tonics of herbs, poultices of bitter roots, prayers whispered by the clergy. But nothing stopped the decline, and still, he refused to change. Like a violin strung too tightly, his body vibrated with strain, every movement threatening to snap the strings entirely. "One more night," he would say. "One more feast." It was as if he believed that by defying his body, he could defy death itself. But death waits for no man, not even a Habsburg archduke. The symbolism was almost cruel. Here was a man born into wealth, born into privilege, born into a dynasty that stretched across Europe, undone not by enemy swords or assassins' daggers, but by his own indulgence. The walls of his palace, once vibrant with music, now seemed to sigh with exhaustion, as though even stone had grown weary of holding up a prince who could not hold himself. Outside the palace, the people of Tyrol muttered. They saw their ruler falter, yet they did not pity him. To them, he was the embodiment of squandered fortune. A man who had taken their taxes, their loyalty, their faith, and poured it into the bottomless pit of excess. Some whispered that his sickness was God's punishment, that heaven itself had chosen to strike down the Archduke for his sins of gluttony and neglect. Others, more cynical, simply shrugged. What else could they expect from a prince raised in velvet, never tempered by hardship? And still the feasts continued. Even as his body screamed, Ferdinand Charles insisted on the rituals of indulgence. The goblets filled, the candles burned, the music played. But the image had changed. Where once he was the radiant host, now he was a specter presiding over his own decline. Every laugh was tinged with pain, every toast a mockery of life slipping away. His courtiers, once eager to join the revels, now raised their goblets with hesitation, their eyes fixed on the hollowed face of a man wasting before them. The tragedy sharpened here, in this betrayal of flesh. Ferdinand Charles was no villain, no tyrant, no schemer. He was a man who had never learned restraint, who mistook indulgence for joy, who believed pleasure could be endless. But the body knows truth, and truth is merciless. His body betrayed him not because it was weak, but because he had made it carry more than any body could endure. Like a candle burning too fiercely, he blazed in brilliance for a moment, then sputtered, then flickered toward darkness. And in the silence of his chambers, when the music faded and the goblet was empty, Ferdinand Charles surely felt what his courtiers dared not speak aloud, that the end was no longer distant. It was near. His body had become the executioner of his soul. It was the winter of 1662, and the snow in Tyrol fell thick and heavy, covering the valleys in silence. In Kaltern, where the vineyards slept under frost, Archduke Ferdinand Charles prepared for what would become his last banquet. Perhaps he did not know it, or perhaps in some hidden corner of his failing body, he did. The invitations had been sent, the halls decorated with garlands, and the wine, always the wine, flowed freely from the cellars. Guests arrived wrapped in furs, their carriages gliding through icy streets, their laughter rising in clouds of white breath against the dark. Inside, the palace burned with life. Candles lined the walls, their flames trembling as though they too feared the night ahead. Musicians tuned their lutes, the first notes shivering into the air like fragile icicles. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted game, sweet pastries, and above all, goblets filled to the brim. To the eye, it was yet another feast, another evening of splendor in the Archduke's endless season of indulgence. But those who looked closely saw the change. Ferdinand Charles appeared at the head of the table, dressed in velvet trimmed with gold. His posture proud, but his body betrayed. His face was pale, his lips tinged with a bluish hue, and his once quick eyes had dulled into something heavy, almost distant. When he raised his goblet, his hand trembled so violently that the wine spilled across the tablecloth, leaving crimson stains that spread like wounds. His courtiers laughed politely, pretending not to notice, but the silence between their glances spoke louder than any song. The music began. Dancers whirled, and servants carried platters steaming with rich meats. Yet the heart of the feast seemed hollow. The Archduke, once the most exuberant presence in any room, now smiled with effort, each expression stretched thin over pain. His laughter, when it came, was brittle, breaking off too soon. He leaned often against the chair, his breathing labored, his brow damp with sweat despite the winter chill. And still, he drank. Perhaps it was defiance, one last rebellion against the body that had betrayed him. Perhaps it was denial, a refusal to admit that his reign of indulgence had reached its end. Or perhaps, most tragically, it was habit, the only ritual he knew, the only crown he ever wore. Each goblet raised was another step toward the grave, and he lifted it as though toasting death itself. Those closest to him, advisors, physicians, even Anna de Medici, watched in silence. They had spoken before, pleaded with him, warned him. Now, they said nothing. Words had lost their power. Only the Archduke could choose, and he had chosen. Midway through the feast, as the musicians struck up a lively tune and the guests clapped in rhythm, Ferdinand Charles stiffened. A sharp pain pierced his chest, his hand clutching at his side. The goblet slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor, the wine spilling like blood across the marble. The hall froze. Music faltered, laughter died. The dancers halted mid-step, their skirts swirling into stillness. For a moment, the only sound was the harsh rattle of his breath. He tried to rise, but his body betrayed him again. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the chair, his face twisted in agony. Servants rushed forward. Physicians called out. Courtiers whispered prayers. The candles flickered wildly as if stirred by a sudden wind, shadows leaping across the walls. The doctors bent over him, fumbling with remedies, herbs, tinctures, whispered invocations, but all in vain. They pressed their fingers to his wrist, shook their heads, and murmured what no one wished to hear. His body, they said, was exhausted, ravaged by years of excess. There was nothing left to save, and yet the feast continued in its grotesque way. The candles still burned, the food still steamed, the music lingered uncertainly, as if the palace itself could not accept that its master was dying. Guests stood in silence, torn between horror and decorum, watching as the Archduke's breath grew shallow, his chest heaving with effort. It is said that in his final moments, Ferdinand Charles's eyes wandered to the goblet lying shattered on the floor, the wine soaking into the cracks of the marble. Perhaps he saw in it the reflection of his life, bright, rich, intoxicating, and then spilled, wasted, gone. Perhaps he thought of the dynasty he had failed to continue, the lands he had drained for fleeting pleasure, the wife he had never truly loved. Or perhaps he thought of nothing at all, his mind clouded by pain and exhaustion, unable to grasp the weight of his own ending. Then, with one final gasp, his body gave way. The hall fell into silence so deep it seemed even the candles paused. At 34 years old, Archduke Ferdinand Charles of Austria was gone. The symbolism was undeniable. He had died as he had lived, in the midst of a feast, surrounded by laughter that was no longer real, by music that could not hide the silence closing in. His life ended not on a battlefield, not in the council chamber, but in a banquet hall, with a goblet at his side and the taste of wine still on his lips. That night, the palace grew colder. Servants extinguished the candles one by one, each flame snuffed out like the years he had never lived. Courtiers departed in uneasy silence, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The food, untouched, rotted in the kitchens. The musicians packed their instruments in shame. And in the center of it all, a man who had once been a prince lay still. His reign ended not by war, not by conspiracy, but by the quiet tyranny of his own appetite. In Kaltern, the snow fell heavier, covering the roofs, muffling the bells, erasing the sound of revels that had ended in tragedy. In the stillness of that winter night, the dynasty of Tyrol's Habsburgs drew its final breath. The last image was cruel in its poetry. A half-empty goblet on the table, a candle flickering low, and the silence of a feast that had finally ended. When the winter dawn broke over Kaltern, its light did not announce a new day, so much as it revealed an ending. The snow still clung to the roofs, the mountains stood eternal, the vineyards lay sleeping under frost. But within the palace, everything had changed. Ferdinand Charles of Austria, Archduke of Tyrol and Vorarlberg, was dead at 34, and with him perished more than a man. A whole branch of the Habsburg tree, already fragile, now cracked and fell away. The first sign of that rupture was silence. The banquet halls that had roared with laughter and music now stood empty, their tables abandoned, the crimson stains of spilled wine marking the marble floors like unwashed blood. Courtiers, once eager to flatter, now tiptoed through corridors, their whispers anxious, their eyes filled with calculation. A prince could be mourned, but power could not wait. Who would hold Tyrol now? What hand would close around its wealth, its passes, its mountains? For Tyrol itself, Ferdinand Charles had been both ruler and ruin. His absence left no heir, no son to take the crown, no daughter to carry his blood into another house. Anna de Medici, his widow, moved like a shadow through the palace, draped in mourning black, her face unreadable. She had shared his name, but not his love. And now she bore the humiliation of a union that had produced nothing. The courtiers bowed to her, but behind closed doors, they spoke of her as a branch that had borne no fruit. The Habsburg family in Vienna wasted little time. Emperor Leopold I, cousin to the deceased Archduke, extended his hand toward Tyrol with the inevitability of a mountain shadow. The land, once entrusted to Ferdinand Charles as a semi-autonomous branch of the dynasty, now reverted to the imperial crown. What had been ruled from Innsbruck now bent again toward Vienna, another piece folded neatly into the vast imperial mosaic. The Medici widow could remain in her palace, yes, but her authority was no more than a ghost. For the people of Tyrol, the change brought little relief. They had endured years of higher taxes, of seeing their rulers squander their wealth on entertainments and indulgence. And now, at his death, they found themselves not freer, but folded deeper into the empire's grasp. The independence they had once tasted, a fragile independence held by their own Archduke, was gone. Innsbruck would no longer host a court of its own, no longer glitter with its own sovereign's feasts. Its palace would become an ornament, its nobility reduced to courtiers of a distant emperor. In taverns and village squares, the people spoke of Ferdinand Charles with bitterness. Some cursed his name, saying he had sold the future for a feast. Others shrugged, resigned. What else could they expect of a man raised in velvet, untouched by hardship? Yet a few voices, quieter, almost reluctant, spoke with pity. He had been weak, yes, but weakness was not wickedness. He had been lost in indulgence, but not cruel. His tragedy was not that he oppressed his people with tyranny, but that he had abandoned them with neglect. They were left not crushed, but forgotten. The symbolism of his death was not lost on anyone. An entire branch of the Habsburg dynasty had ended, not with a blaze of battle or storm of conspiracy, but with a candle guttering in a banquet hall, a goblet spilled across the floor. The Habsburgs, whose family tree had spread across Europe, producing emperors, kings, and queens, now saw one of its limbs wither into nothing. Tyrol, once proud of its own Archduke, now bowed again to Vienna, its identity absorbed into the empire. In the Hofkirche of Innsbruck, his body was laid to rest. The church, heavy with incense, echoed with chants as priests intoned prayers for his soul. Yet even here, among the cold stone and gilded altars, his presence seemed small. Around him lay the tombs of Habsburg ancestors, warriors, rulers, men who had commanded armies or built kingdoms. His coffin, though draped in velvet and marked with his title, felt like an afterthought, a punctuation mark in a sentence already fading. Anna de' Medici stood at the funeral, her veil covering her face. Some said she did not shed a tear. Perhaps she mourned privately, or perhaps she had no grief left to give to a man who had shared her life but not her heart. After the ceremony, she returned to the palace, where she would live quietly for many years more. A widow without a dynasty, a queen without a court. And what of Ferdinand Charles's memory? In Vienna, he was remembered not as a prince of promise, but as a cautionary tale. Chroniclers noted his excess, his indulgence, his wasted potential. He became a lesson whispered to young princes, that a crown can be squandered not only by tyranny or war, but by pleasure. In the great family tree of the Habsburgs, his name became a small branch cut off too soon, marked by a note of pity rather than pride. The people of Tyrol, too, carried the memory of his reign like a sour taste. They did not celebrate him, nor did they despise him as they might a tyrant. Instead, they remembered him as the prince who had let their land slip away, who had chosen wine over duty, who had died too young to leave a mark except as a warning. His death was their loss, but his life had already foretold it. So the dynasty ended, not with trumpets, not with swords, but with silence. The halls of Innsbruck fell quiet. The banners of the Archduke were folded and stored. The coin of Tyrol now bore another's face. The laughter that had once shaken the palace was gone, leaving only the echo of emptiness. And if one walked through the vineyards of Kaltern in the years that followed, they would find the vines heavy with grapes, the wine flowing as ever. But for those who remembered, the taste carried a bitterness. For it was not only Ferdinand Charles who had drowned in wine, but the very future of Tyrol's independence. A dynasty cut short, a branch withered, a legacy lost in the bottom of a goblet. The death of Ferdinand Charles did not fall into silence as swiftly as the snow that buried the roads of Caltern. Among courtiers, merchants, and even peasants in taverns, a murmur began to rise, a murmur that turned into rumor, and rumor that thickened into suspicion. For when a prince dies young, when a dynasty is cut off in its bloom, people rarely accept that it was mere indulgence, mere folly of the flesh. No, they demand a story of treachery, of hidden daggers, of poison slipped into a cup. And so, the whispers began. The Archduke did not drink himself to death. He was poisoned. Some said it was Anna de' Medici. De' Medici, his widow, who had tired of his neglect and sought freedom in widowhood. Others insisted it was the emperor in Vienna, eager to bring Tyrol firmly back into his own grasp without the obstacle of a wayward cousin. Still others pointed to jealous courtiers, rivals at banquets, or even foreign agents, each story darker than the last. The absence of an heir, the suddenness of his death, the wine-stained tablecloth. These became threads woven into tales of murder. It was easy to believe. Poison, after all, was the weapon of choice in courts across Europe, silent and effective, slipping through the veins unseen. The Medici name itself carried the weight of such stories. In Florence, whispers of poisoned rings, laced powders, and deadly draughts had haunted the family for generations. Anna's presence beside her husband in his final days only fueled the fire. If not she, then who? If not that final feast, then when? Yet for all the whispers, for all the tales told in hushed voices over flickering candles, there was no proof. No apothecary confessed, no servant testified, no letter surfaced. Modern historians, with clearer eyes and firmer evidence, have brushed aside the rumors. They argue what should have been obvious. Ferdinand Charles poisoned himself, not with a single draught, but with years of indulgence. The wine that killed him was not delivered by another's hand, but by his own, poured again and again, night after night, until his body could endure no more. And yet, isn't that a kind of poison too? The line between murder and self-destruction is thin when viewed through the haze of history. Was it less tragic that he chose the cup himself, rather than having it offered by an enemy? Or was it more tragic, because he knew deep down that each sip brought him closer to the grave? And he drank anyway? The rumors endured because they answered a need. People craved drama, a reason beyond the dull, grinding truth of excess. To die at 34 of wine seemed unworthy of a prince, unworthy of the grandeur of the Habsburg name. But to be poisoned, that was a tale, a story fit for whispers in taverns, for pages in chronicles, for suspicion to linger in corridors long after the man himself was gone. One can almost imagine the scene as storytellers painted it. A goblet set before him at the final feast, its rim gleaming in candlelight. A hand, whose hand? Pouring not just wine but venom into its depths. Ferdinand Charles raising it, oblivious, smiling, toasting, drinking, and with that drink sealing his fate. The image is cinematic, dramatic, haunting, and yet it is also false. The truth was less theatrical, but no less cruel. He was not betrayed by wife or emperor or servant, but by his own desires. The poisoner was not hidden in the crowd, but stared back from the mirror. It was he who lifted the cup, night after night. He who laughed as the red liquid spilled across the tablecloth. He who chose the revel over restraint, the feast over silence, the goblet over the chalice of responsibility. The poison was wine itself, and the murderer was the man who would not stop drinking it. And here lies the paradox of Ferdinand Charles. The rumors of poison gave him more dignity in death than the truth did. For in those rumors, he was the victim of conspiracy, of politics, of hidden daggers. In truth, he was the victim of himself. Which story is more tragic? Which story is more human? Perhaps that is why the whispers never fully died. They were retold, embroidered, embellished, because they gave people something easier to believe than the unbearable image of a prince undone by his own weakness. They turned his death into a mystery instead of a cautionary tale. They gave his life an enemy, rather than admitting that the enemy had always been within. One chronicler, centuries later, wrote with cruel clarity, "Sometimes the hand that pours the poison is the same that lifts the cup." And in those words lies the essence of Ferdinand Charles's tragedy. Whether poisoned by another or by himself, he died as a man who had forgotten restraint, who mistook indulgence for immortality, who thought the cup would always refill, never realizing that every goblet drained was another step toward an empty grave. So the whispers of poison became part of his story. Not true, perhaps, but persistent, like the echo of laughter in a long empty hall. They haunt his memory not because they reveal who killed him, but because they reveal how unwilling we are to accept that a prince, with all his riches and power, could be brought low by something so simple, so ordinary, so human as a goblet of wine. In the grand tapestry of Habsburg history, certain figures loom like towering statues. Emperors draped in imperial robes, queens crowned with jewels, generals mounted on prancing horses, their names etched into the stones of Vienna, Madrid, or Prague. And then there are others, smaller threads, so faint they can barely be seen unless one looks closely. Ferdinand Charles of Austria belongs to the latter. He is not remembered with reverence nor cursed with infamy. He is remembered hardly at all. When one turns the pages of Habsburg chronicles, his name appears like a footnote. Archduke of Tyrol, died in 1662. No campaigns attached to his title, no treaties signed by his hand, no children to carry his blood. His reign is described in a handful of lines, and then the chroniclers move swiftly onward, as though embarrassed to linger. In a family that produced emperors, kings, and rulers of vast dominions, Ferdinand Charles was a shadow. And yet, shadows linger. In Innsbruck, his palace still stands, its halls now echoing not with music and laughter, but with the heavy footsteps of tourists or caretakers. The great banqueting halls are empty, their ceilings painted with fading frescoes. The marble floors, once stained with spilled wine, gleam with polished silence. If one stands in the center of those rooms and closes their eyes, perhaps they might hear faintly the echoes of lutes, the roar of laughter, the clink of goblets. But those echoes are ghosts, not memories. In the Hofkirche of Innsbruck, his tomb lies among the others, an archduke's coffin placed alongside the mightier dead of the dynasty. But here too, he is diminished. Around him stand the towering cenotaph of Emperor Maximilian I, carved with dozens of larger-than-life statues, generals, knights, kings, and saints. Their bronze faces glare with determination, their armor gleams with the weight of history. And then, somewhere in the shadows, rests Ferdinand Charles, a coffin draped in bronze, yes, but unremarkable, almost invisible. If not for a plaque with his name, one could walk past and never notice. It is as though history itself conspired to dim his light, to erase the memory of his excess, his laughter, his tragedy. He was not assassinated, not dethroned, not exiled, fates that might have made him memorable. Instead, he simply drank himself to death. A man whose life was loud, whose nights were filled with noise, but whose memory became silence. And yet, there is something haunting in that silence. In a dynasty obsessed with legacy, with bloodlines, with the endless continuity of power, Ferdinand Charles left nothing. No heir, no monument, no triumph. His name did not echo forward through descendants. His marriage bed was barren, his throne empty. When he died, Tyrol slipped quietly back into the folds of the empire, as though his reign had been nothing more than a temporary diversion. To the people of Innsbruck, he became a story told with bitterness or humor. The prince who feasted while they paid. The ruler who chose wine over governance. The archduke who left them nothing but debts. But even those stories faded. As the decades passed, new rulers rose, new wars consumed Europe, and Ferdinand Charles was left behind. His memory, like the wine he spilled, evaporated into the air. Perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all. Not to be hated, not to be feared, not even to be loved, but simply to be forgotten. And yet, in being forgotten, he becomes a symbol. For what is history, if not a mirror of human fragility? Not every prince becomes a king. Not every heir leaves a dynasty. Not every life, no matter how gilded, leaves a mark. Some lives, even those wrapped in velvet and crowned with titles, vanish like smoke after a banquet. In this sense, Ferdinand Charles's story is not merely personal. It is a reminder of how fragile legacy can be. His ancestors had built empires, but his own name became a whisper. He had wealth beyond imagining, yet none of it could buy memory. He had a court filled with music and splendor, yet all of it dissolved the moment he died. What remains? A plaque, a coffin, a name in genealogies, and the faint outline of a man who let indulgence erase him. The chroniclers, when they do mention him, rarely linger on his face. There are portraits, of course, oil on canvas, capturing him with the pale features of a Habsburg, dressed in finery, a hand resting on a hilt or a table. But even these portraits feel perfunctory, as if painted out of duty rather than inspiration. Unlike the fiery gaze of a warrior king or the stately poise of an empress, his portraits do not command. They simply exist. Looking at them, one struggles to imagine the man, the laughter, the indulgence, the wine-stained breath. He seems already like a ghost, even in life. And so, the Archduke became not a hero nor a villain, but an absence, the forgotten Archduke. It is fitting in a way that he rests in Innsbruck, a city beautiful, but often overshadowed by Vienna, by Prague, by the great capitals of Europe. Innsbruck, like Ferdinand Charles, sits in the shadow of greater powers, admired but overlooked, remembered only in passing. The mountains guard the city, eternal and silent, while beneath them lie the bones of a man whose name slips easily from memory. Yet forgetting does not erase the lesson. In every empty hall, in every silent tomb, there lingers a whisper. That power is fragile. That legacy is not guaranteed. That even princes can vanish into obscurity. Ferdinand Charles may be forgotten by most, but in that forgetting, he speaks more loudly than if he had been remembered with grandeur. His life is a reminder that history does not honor excess. It honors restraint, discipline, the ability to build rather than consume. Without those virtues, even an archduke can become nothing more than a note at the bottom of a page, a name in a family tree, a tomb in the shadows of greater monuments. The forgotten are not gone. They are the quiet warnings written between the lines of history's grander stories. And Ferdinand Charles of Austria, Archduke of Tyrol, is one such warning. History is a gallery of portraits. Some are painted in bold strokes of conquest and glory, others in the shadowed hues of tragedy and waste. Ferdinand Charles of Austria belongs to the second. His short, indulgent life, 34 years steeped in feasts, wine, and avoidance of duty, offers not only a story of one man's weakness, but a reflection of an entire age. The Baroque aristocracy, shimmering on the outside, hollow within. For what truly destroyed him, it was not the blade of an assassin, nor the schemes of a rival court. It was wine. Wine in quantities so great that it became both crown and coffin. To call it simply alcoholism is to reduce the tragedy to a medical term. In his time, no such diagnosis existed. There were only choices, repeated until they became chains. Each toast, each goblet, each night of laughter was a brick in the wall of his downfall. And yet, the wine itself was never only wine. It was power in liquid form. At a banquet table, the goblet symbolized wealth, hospitality, authority. A ruler who poured generously displayed his greatness. To drink without restraint was to show that he feared no lack, no hunger, no tomorrow. For Ferdinand Charles, the goblet was not only a comfort, but a stage. Raising it meant proving he was sovereign. Emptying it meant proving he was invincible. But each performance cost him more of his body, his strength, his future. There is a lesson here, and it stretches far beyond Tyrol, beyond the 17th century. Excess is its own kind of tyranny. It promises joy, but delivers decay. It flatters the ego, but empties the soul. A prince who believes his power shields him from consequence learns too late that the body does not bow to titles. His heart did not care that he was Archduke. His liver did not kneel to Habsburg blood. Flesh is flesh, and it breaks under the same weight whether peasant or prince. For the Habsburg dynasty, Ferdinand Charles was a cautionary tale. He proved that noble bloodline alone cannot sustain a realm. A family that built its empire on discipline, marriage alliances, and rigid Catholic order now saw a branch rot from within, not because of enemies, but because of its own indulgence. His failure mirrored a broader decline, a Baroque decadence spreading through courts across Europe. Palaces that glowed with gold leaf while peasants starved outside. Rulers who mistook pageantry for governance, spectacles for substance. And so his life became a parable. Imagine, if you will, a goblet on a banquet table. One man lifts it and drinks to seal a treaty that saves his people. Another lifts it and drinks to numb his loneliness. The first strengthens his realm. The second weakens it. Wine is not the villain. Choice is. But when choice is clouded by indulgence, when appetite rules instead of discipline, then wine becomes the executioner. This duality, wine as sacrament, wine as poison, carries through history. In churches, it was Christ's blood, sacred and eternal. In palaces, it was laughter, celebration, vitality. But in the case of Ferdinand Charles, it became something darker, self-destruction wrapped in ritual. The goblet that should have been a tool of diplomacy, of communion with his people, was instead the noose around his dynasty's neck. The lesson grows sharper when we see what followed. With his death, Tyrol returned to Vienna's control, its fragile independence gone. His marriage left no heir, his line extinguished. The cost of indulgence was not only his life, but the sovereignty of his land. In drowning himself, he drowned the future of his house. Here is the stark truth. Rulers do not die alone. Their choices ripple outward, washing over subjects, families, and lands. When a prince wastes himself, he wastes his people too. And yet, the story invites a deeper reflection. Why do men in power so often mistake indulgence for freedom? Perhaps because power isolates. Surrounded by flatterers, Ferdinand Charles mistook their laughter for loyalty. Surrounded by abundance, he mistook consumption for strength. Surrounded by music, he mistook noise for meaning. His tragedy was not only in what he did, but in what he never learned. That restraint, though quieter, is the true companion of endurance. For the modern eye, his life feels eerily familiar. We live in an age of excess too, of endless feasts of information, entertainment, distraction. Like Ferdinand Charles, we raise goblets daily, not of wine perhaps, but of indulgence in its many forms. And like him, we risk mistaking abundance for invincibility. His story, though buried in a footnote of Habsburg history, whispers a warning to us. What is consumed without measure will, in the end, consume the consumer. The imagery of his death lingers, a half-empty goblet, a banquet hall frozen in silence, a young man collapsing in velvet while candles sputtered overhead. It is almost too poetic, too theatrical. Yet the symbolism is real. A dynasty ended in laughter that was hollow, in music that could not disguise decline, in the glow of candles that burned themselves out. His life became an allegory written in spilled wine. Beauty wasted, promise squandered, power undone. The question remains, what is a ruler for? To delight himself, or to secure the future of his people? To feast endlessly, or to leave behind something that lasts longer than his own body? Ferdinand Charles answered one way, and history answered another. His goblets are empty, his halls are silent, his name nearly erased. The lesson is harsh but clear. A prince who drinks only for himself leaves nothing for others. So the wine that drowned him becomes, for us, a mirror. We see in it the cost of indulgence, the fragility of flesh, the emptiness of power without discipline. And though his name is nearly forgotten, the warning he leaves is unforgettable. A goblet raised may bring joy for a night, but too many goblets raised will bury a dynasty. Ferdinand Charles of Austria was not a villain carved into history's granite. He was not a tyrant whose cruelty etched scars across a land. Nor was he a hero, crowned with victories. He was instead something far more unsettling. Ordinary in his weakness, fragile in his appetites, undone not by war or treason, but by the simplest of choices, choices repeated until they became destiny. And perhaps that is why his story clings to us, because it is easy to condemn tyrants and easy to glorify conquerors. But what do we do with the man who fails quietly, who wastes himself not out of malice, but out of inability to resist the comforts laid before him? Ferdinand Charles reminds us that history is not only shaped by towering wills, it is also shaped, and sometimes destroyed, by those who cannot master their own desires. In him, we see the paradox of privilege. To be born into power is to carry the weight of expectation, yet also to live in a world that shields you from consequence. For Ferdinand Charles, that shield became his undoing. Surrounded by servants who obeyed, by courtiers who flattered, by wealth that seemed endless, he mistook indulgence for freedom. But true freedom is not the absence of restraint. It is the mastery of it. There is, too, a strange tenderness in his failure. He was not cruel, not bloodthirsty. He was a man who laughed too loudly, drank too deeply, and lived as if tomorrow would always wait. His tragedy is human, painfully so. We may shake our heads at his excess, but we also recognize the reflection of our own temptations. The glass raised too often. The indulgence justified just this once. The belief that limits are for others, not for us. In that mirror, his story ceases to be just about a Habsburg prince. It becomes about us. And so his tomb, quiet in the Hofkirche of Innsbruck, becomes more than a coffin in bronze. It becomes a question. What will we leave behind? Will our days be consumed in indulgence that vanishes with us? Or will they echo into something greater, something that survives beyond our bodies? Ferdinand Charles left no heirs, no legacy, only a warning etched in silence. The new thought that lingers is this: perhaps forgetting him is itself part of the lesson. History allowed his name to fade because indulgence alone is not worth remembering. The world remembers those who build, those who endure, those who restrain themselves enough to create something that outlasts them. The silence around his story is not neglect, it is judgment. And yet, here we are, centuries later, speaking his name again. That, too, is part of the human impulse. To exhume the forgotten, to learn from the wasted, to turn even failure into meaning. So let Ferdinand Charles of Austria stand not as a lost archduke, but as a mirror we dare not look away from. He reminds us that the greatest dangers to dynasties and to ourselves do not always come from enemies outside. Sometimes, the hand that destroys is our own. If his story moved you, if you want to uncover more forgotten lives buried in history's shadows, then join us. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled, where we shine a light on the tragedies, the silences, and the fragile humanity that history tried to erase. For in remembering them, we remember ourselves.